Yeah, welcome everyone. We're going to start with a short introduction from Rabbi Silber, followed by the chanting of Megillat Eicha.
All right, we're about to read Eicha together virtually. I just wanted to say very briefly something about the reading of Eicha. We have two occasions when we are reading the Tanakh, essentially, at night. There are actually three occasions, but one of them, which is Simchat Torah, then we read the Torah, we take out the Torah to dance. And once you take out the Torah to dance, it's not appropriate just to put it back without reading it. So that's the reason we read it the night of Simchat Torah. But the other two times that we are reading from the Ketuvim, two Megillot, one is the Megillat Eicha, called Kinot, and the other, of course, is Megillat Esther. And those 2 days are, from one perspective, very different. But actually, from a different perspective, they're extremely similar. Because they both essentially address the same question. Megillat Esther, the Megillah, so it's a book which never mentions God. God never speaks in the Megillah. There's absolutely no mention of God, a point that was commented upon by many. Gemara, of course, famously says, Esther min haTorah minayin, what is the biblical, where are the Torah roots of the book of Esther? And they quote the pasuk in the end of Sefer Dvarim, Anochi haster panai b'yom hahu, I will conceal my face at that time. So Megillat Esther is all about God's hiddenness, God's concealment. And the reality of the book is it begins with the court of Achashverosh, it ends with Achashverosh. There's absolutely no sense in the book, at least my understanding of it, that the return to Zion is in any manner, shape, or form part of this book. It begins in exile, it ends in exile, and the issue, essentially, is we are here in exile. What do we do about it? How do we survive, given the culture of Parasa Madai, the culture of exile, the leadership, etc. And Esther and Mordechai together try to figure out how we live in a world in which God is hidden. That's what the Megillah is all about. The Megillah we read tonight, which is Eicha, also known as the Book of Kinot, the 5 chapters of Lamentations, elegies, is also about God's hiddenness. That's the lamentation. God is missing in action, one might say. We attribute many of our problems to that fact. At one point in the Megillah, if God is present at all, it's as an adversary rather than as a comforter. So the two situations that the two Megillot address are actually, I would say, virtually identical. The absence of God, the hiddenness of God. But the difference is that in the book of Eicha, the elegies, we don't accept the reality of living in exile. We have an aspiration that someday we will once again stand in God's presence. And that's how the Megillah ends, actually. Har Zion sheshamim shoalim hilchubo. On Har Zion, the holy Har Zion, the foxes walk through it. Why have you abandoned us, seemingly forever? So we end, actually, the next to last verse, which is repeated at the end of Eicha. Hashivenu Hashem Elecha, bring us back. So that's a different sense. It's not a sense of this is the world as it is, and this is what it is, and deal with reality, which is the story of Esther. It's a story with a relatively happy ending because we find a way to deal with the reality, not just to survive, but to put in place a plan about living with this reality. But the book of Eicha and the day of Tisha B'Av is different. It's about sadness, it's about what's missing, but it's also about our hopes. And precisely because we have hopes and we have plans and aspirations precisely because of that, we're unwilling to accept the sad reality. We're familiar with the reality, but we don't actually accept it. And we try to live with these two different perspectives. From one perspective, I think it's very important to accept elements of reality. This is where we are. And what do we do about it? We can't wish it away. It's not going to disappear. The realities and the unfortunate realities are with us. And we try to figure out the best way to cope with the difficulties of life. At the same time, it could lead us to forget about our dreams and our hopes and our prayers. So I think Tisha B'Av, the Megillah, the Eicha, is about not forgetting the dreams. It's about remembering the promises, aspiring and hoping that we'll see the fulfillment, hopefully sooner rather than later. Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuva, we ask God to bring us back. Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, to bring us back to a better time. Some of the good memories we have in the past, you can't go back in history, but maybe we can take those good pieces of our past and move forward together with them. So the two readings of the night of Purim and the night of Tisha B'Av, have much in common and reflect two very different and two very important ways of thinking about the present condition and its problems. One is to deal in the here and now, and the other is not to forsake the dreams. Okay, so we'll read the Eicha now, and afterwards, after we finish, I'll give a brief shiur, once again, about some of the elements of the book of Eicha. Hopefully there'll be an opportunity for people to unmute themselves and to talk up. Okay, so let's begin now with the Eicha.
Ravati v'goyim, sarati b'medinot, hayta lamas, v'chotiv kabalayla, v'dimata alechayai, lamenachem mikol korea b'geduva, hayula le'oivim. Galta Yehuda me'ani u'merav avada, hi yashva v'goyim l'matzah manach, kol radfa yisiguha bin ha'metzarim, darchei tzion avilot, mibli b'hem moed, kol shara shomimim, konan anachim, V'tilatanu g'tehimar hayitzara l'rashai v'hashalu ki Adonai hoga rufesha halala achushavi lifnei tzar hayitzim mibatzion kol hadara hayisara Kayalim lamatzu mira v'yalchu v'lachach lifnei rodef Zachra Yerushalayim Yemei aniya u'merida kol machamuda asher hayu mimei kadam b'nfal amad v'yatzar v'in ozer la re'a'u hatzarim Zachaku al mishpatah, v'ed chata Yerushalayim, haken l'nida hayata, v'mechata hisila kira'u ervata, kam hinencha v'tashva chor, tumata v'shuleha, lo zachra acharita v'terad pelayim, Emenachem Re Adonai etoni kigdil hayev Yado paras tsar Al kol mechamada Hirata goyim ba'u mikdasha Asher tzivita Lo yavo v'kahalach כל המען אנוכי מבקשים לכם, נתנו מחמדיהם, באוכל להשיב נפש, ראה אדוני והביטה, כי הייתי זוללה. לכם כופרי דרך, הביטו וראו, אם יש מחוב כמחובי, אשר לא לי, אשר הוגה אדוני ביום חרנפו. ממרום שלח איש בעצמותי וירדנה, פרס רשת לרגלי, השיבני אחור, נתנני שוממה, כל היום דבר. נזכר על פשעי בידו, הסתרגו, עלו על צווארי, הכשיל כוחי, נתנני אדוני בידי לא אוכל קום. צילה כל פראי אדוני בקרבי, קרא עלי, מועד לשבור בחורי, כת טרח אדוני לבטלת בת יהודה, עלילה אני בכייה, איני ירדה מים, כי רחק ממני, מנחם משיב נפשי, היו בני שוממים, כי גבר אוהב. פרסת ציון בידה, אין מנחם לה, ציווה אדוני, ויעקב סביביו צריו, הייתה ירושלים, לנידה ביניהם. צדיק הוא, אדוני כפיר מראיתי, שמונה כל העמים, וראו מחובי, בתלותי ובחורי הלכו בשבי. קראתי למהווה הם הרימוני, כהני זקני בעיר גבהו, כי ביקשו אוכל דמו, וישיבו את נפשם. ראה אדוני כי צר לי מאי חמרמרו, נפח ליבי בקרבי, כי מרו מריתי, מחוץ שקלה חרב, בבית גם מוות. שמעו כי ננחה אני, אין מנחם לי, כל אויבי, שמעו רעתי, ששו, כי אתה עשית, הבאת יום קראת וירחמוני. תבוא חלרתם לפניך ועולה עולמו, כאשר עוללת לי על כל פשעי, כי רבות הנחותי בליבי דברי.
איכה יעיב באפו אדוני את בת ציון, ישליך משמיים ארץ, תפארת ישראל, ולא זכר אדום רגליו ביום אפו. בילה אדוני ולא חמל, את כל נאות יעקב, הרס בעברתו, מבצרי בת יהודה הגיע לארץ, חילל ממלכה ושריה, גדל בחורייו, כל קרן ישראל השיבה חור, ימינו מפני אויב, ויבער ביעקב כאש להבה, אוכלה סביב. טורח קשתו כאויב, ניצב ימינו כצר, ויהרוג כל מחמדי עין. באוהל בת ציון שפך כאש חמתו. היה אדוני כאויב בילה ישראל, בילה כל ארמנותיה שיחת מבצריו. וירב בבת יהודה תעניה ועניה. ויחמוס כגן סוכו שיחת מועדו. שוב שיקח אדוני בציון מועד לשבת, וינעץ בזמן אפו מלך וכהן. זנח אדוני מזבחו ניער מקדשו, הזכיר ביד אויב חומות ארמנותיה. כל נתנו בבית אדוני כי יום מועד. חשב אדוני להשחית חומת בציון, נטע קו לא השיב ידו מבעליה. ויבל חיל וחומה יחדיו אומללו. טבעו בארץ שעריה, איבד ושיבר בריחיה. מלכה ושריה וגויים אין תורה, עם נביאיה לא מצאו חזון מאדוני. ישבו לארץ ידמו זקני בת ציון, העלו עפר על ראשם, חגרו שקים. הורידו לארץ ראשן, בתולות ירושלים. כלו בדמעות עיני, חמרמרו מעי. נשפך לארץ כבדי, על שבר בת עמי. בתפלל ויונק, ברחובות קריה. לימותם יאמרו, איה דגן ויין. התאבתם כחלל ברחובות עיר, בהשתפך נפשם אל חיק אמותם. מה איתך, מה אדם אלך, רבת ירושלים, מה שווה לך ונחמך בתולת בת ציון, כי גדול קיים שברך מרפלך. נביאייך חזו לך שב ותפל, ולא גילו על עוונך להשיב שבותך. ויחזו לך מסות שווא ומדוכים. ספקו עלייך כפיים כל עוברי דרך, סרקו וניעו ראשם על בת ירושלים. הזאת העיר שיאמרו כלילת יופי, משוש לכל הארץ. פצו עלייך פיהם ככל אויבייך, שרקו ויחרקו שן, אמרו בי לנו. אך זה היום שקיווינו, מצאנו ראינו. עשה אדוני אשר זמם, ביצע אמרתו אשר ציווה מימי קדם, הרס ולא חמל. וישמח עלייך אויב, הרים קרן צריך. צעק ליבם אל אדוני, חומת בת ציון. הורידי כנחל דמעה יומם ולילה. אל תתני פוקת לך, אל תדום בת עינך. קומי רוני בלילה, לראש השמועות. שפכי חמים ליבך, נוכח פני אדוני. שאי אליו כפייך, על נפש עוללייך, עטופים ברעב בראש כל חוצות. ראה אדוני והביטה, למי עוללת כה? אם תאכלנה נשים פריים עוללי טיפוחים, אם יהרג במקדש אדוני כהן ונביא. שכבו לארץ חוצות נער וזקן, בתולותיי ובחולי נפלו בחרב. הרגת ביום אפיך, טבחת לא חמלת. תקרא כיום מועד מגורי מסביב, ולא היה ביום אף אדוני פליט ושריד, אשר טיפחתי וריביתי אויבי חילם.
אני הגבר העוני בשבט עברתו, אותי נהר וילך חושך ולא אור, אך בישוב יהפוך ידו כל היום, הילה בשרי ואורי שיבה עצמותיי, ונעלי ויקח ראש ותלה, ומחשכים הושיבני כמתי עולם, גדר בדי ולא אצא הכביד נחשתי, גם כי אזעק להשביה שתם תפילתי, גדר דרכי בגזית נטיותיי היבה, לא בורר לי ארי במסתרים, דרכי סובב ויפשטני שמני שומם, דרך קשתו ויציבני המטרה לחץ, הביא מחיותיו בני השפטו, הייתי שחוק לכל עמי נגינתם כל היום, השפיעני במרורים הרמני ענק, לגריס לחצת שיני הכבישני בהפר, ותזנח משלום נפשי נשיתי טובה, ואומר עבד נצחי ותאכלתי מאדוני, זכרני אל מורי ענה בראש, זכור תזכור ותשוך עלי נפשי, זאת אשיב אל ליבי על כן אוכיל, חסדי אדוני כי לא תמנו, כי לא חלו רחמיו, חדשים לבקרים רבה אמונתך, אל כי אדוני אמרה נפשי, על כן אוכילו. טוב אדוני לכל העם, לנפש תדרשנו, טוב ויכיל בדומם לתשועת אדוני, טוב לגבר כי שאול בגבוריו, ישב בדד וידום כי נטל עליו, ייתן בעפר פיהו אולי יש תקווה, ייתן למכהו לכי ישפט בחרפה, כי לא יזנח לעולם אדוני, כי אם הוגה וריחם כרב חסדיו, כי לא ינעל מליבו ויגב בני איש, לדכא תחת רגליו כל עשי הארץ, להטות משפט גבר נגד בני עליון, להביא את הדם בריבו אדוני לא אהב, מזה אמר ותהי אדוני לא ציווה, מפי עליון לא תצא הרעות והטוב. ויתודד אדם חי גבר על חטאיו. נחפשה דרכינו ונחקורה ונשובה עד אדוני. נישא לבבינו אל כפיים אל בשמיים. אנחנו פשענו ומרינו אתה לא סלחת. צעקות אהב ותרדפנו הרגת לא חמלת. צעקות וענן לך מעבור תפילה. זכרי ועמוס תשימני בקרב עמים. פצו עלינו פיהם עוד אויבינו. פחד ופחד היה לנו השת והשחר. הגמיים תרדני על שבר בת עמי. איני נגרע ולא תדמה בין הפלוגות. עד ישקיף הירא אדוני בשמיים. איני עוללה לנפשי מכל בנות עירי. תצעדוני כציפור אויבי חינם. תמתו בבור חיי וידעו אבן בי. צפו מים על ראשי אמרתי נגזרתי. קראתי שמך אדוני מבור תחתיות. קולי שמעת אל תדע אוזנך. לרווחתי לשבתי. פרחתי ביום אקראך. אמרת לו אל תירא. אהבת אדוני ריבי נפשי גאלת חיי. ראית אדוני אהבתי שופטה משפטי. ראית כל נקמתם כל מחשבותם לי. שמעת חרפתם אדוני כל מחשבותם עלי. צוותי קמי והגיונם עלי כל היום. שבטם בקמתתם הביטה אני מנגינתם. תשאיר להם גמול אדוני מעשה ידיהם. תיתן להם מגינת לב נתתך להם. תרדוף באף ותשמידם מתחת שמי אדוני.
Eicha yom zahav yishneh ketem hatov tishtapechnav lekodesh berosh kol chutzot b'nei Tzion hayikarim hamesulaim bapaz Eicha nechshevu lenivlei cheres maseh yedei yotzer Gam tanim chalzu shad, eini kugurehen, batami leachzar, kayenim bamidbar, tavach lishon yonek, el chiko batzama, olalim shalu lechem, pores em lahem, haochlim lamadanim, Nashamu bachutzot, haemunim alei, tolachim ku ashpatot, vayigdal alon batami, mechatat sedom, hafuchach emoraga, velo chaluva yadayim. Zaku nezireha mihisheleg, zachu mechalav, adu etzem mipninim, sapir gizratam. חשך משחור טהרם, לא נקראו בחוצות. צפד אורם על עצמם, יבש היה חיץ. טובים היו חללי חרב, מחללי רעב, שהם יעזבו מדוכרים, מתנועות שדי. ידי נשים רחמניות, בישלו ילדיהן, היו לברות לעמו בשבר בתמיד. כי לה אדוני את חמתו, שפה אחרון אפו, ויצאת אש בציון, ותאכל יסודותיה. לא האמינו מלכי ארץ, כל יושבי תבל, כי יבוא צר ואויב בשערי ירושלים. מחטאות נביאיה, עוונות כהניה, השופכים בקרבה דם צדיקים. נעו עברים בחוצות, נגואלו בדם, ולא יוכלו ייגעו בלבושיהם. סורו טמא, קראו למו, סורו אל תיגעו, כי נטו גם נהו, אמרו בגויים לא יוסיפו לגור. פני אדוני חילקם, לא יוסיף להביטם. פני כהנים לא נשאו, וזקנים לא חננו. עודנה תכלנה עינינו, אל עזרתנו הבל, בציפייתנו ציפינו, אל גוי לא יושיע. צעדו צעדינו, מלאכת ברחובותינו, קרב קיצנו, מלאו ימינו, כי בקיצנו. קלים היו רודפינו, מנשרי שמיים, על ההרים דלקונו, במדבר ערבו לנו. רוח אפינו משיח אדוני, נלכד בשחיתותם, אשר אמרנו בצילו נחיה בגויים. שישי ושמחי בת אדום, יושבת בארץ עוץ, גם עלייך תעבור כוס, תשכרי ותתערי. תם עוונך בציון, לא יוסיף להגלותך, פקד עוונך בת אדום, גילה על חטאותייך.
זכור אדוני מהיה לנו, הבית ורת חרפתנו. נחלתנו נחל זרים, בתינו לנוכרים. יתומים היינו ואינם, אמותינו כאלמנות. מימינו בכסף שתינו, עצנו במחיר יבואו. על צווארנו נרדפנו, יגענו ולא נחלנו. מצרים נתנו יד, אשור לצבוא עליכם. אבותינו חטאו ואינם, ואנחנו עוונותיהם סבלנו. עבדים משלו בנו, פורק אין מידם. בנפשנו נביא לחמנו, מפני חרב המדבר. אורינו כתנור נחמרו, מפני זעפות רב. נשים בציון הינו, בתולות בערי יהודה. שרים בידם נתלו, בני זקנים לא נדרו. בחורים תכלו נשאו, ונערים בעת כשלו. זקנים ישר שבתו, בחורים מנגינתם.
Shavat mesos libeinu, nefach level nefoleinu. Nafla ateret roshenu, oina lanu, ki chatanu. Al zeh hayad aveli beinu, alei lechashchu eineinu. Al har Tzion sheshamim, shualim yofuo. Ata Adonai l'olam teshev, kisacha l'dor vador. Lama lanesach tishkachenu, ta'azvenu le'orech yamim. Hashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh yameinu kekedem. Ki imaos me'astanu, katzafta aleinu ad meod. Ashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva, Chadesh yameinu kekedem.
Thank you to our readers. We are going to take a short break and reconvene in about 4 minutes at 9:10 for our shiur with Rabbi Silber.
All right, so just I wanted to speak briefly about Tisha B'Av and about the keynote. So let me just begin with saying something very brief about Tisha B'Av itself, the day of Tisha B'Av. The day of Tisha B'Av, it's a fast day. The Mishnah talks about it as one of the fast days. It's found in Masechet Tanit, which deals with fast days, typically days that become fast days because of circumstance, the main one being a lack of rain. Could be other difficulties, etc. And in addition to those fast days, and there's a whole procedure about the fast days, and there's an order to the fast days. They're of increasing severity, but there also are sort of public fast days that mark events in the calendar. So most of them center around the destruction of the temple. There's the encirclement of Jerusalem. There's the breaching of the wall, and there's the destruction of the temples actually. And these are marked by Asar B'Tevet and Shiva B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. And then, of course, there is Tzom Gedalia, the day after Rosh Hashanah, and that marks the assassination of Gedalia, and that was sort of the final straw, and that essentially leads to the exile of the remaining people from the land. But fundamentally, they revolve around those events, main one being destruction of the temple, and these are all fast days. So Tisha B'Av is a fast day. And actually, it's an interesting fast day because outside of Yom Kippur, which is in a class by itself, it's the only real fast day that we have. Because a fast day is a 24-hour fast day. The other fast days, Asar B'Tevet and Shiva B'Tammuz, Tzom Gedalia, not to speak of Ta'anit Esther, which is actually just a custom. It's not found in the Talmud at all. But the fast days, we only fast during the daytime. The fast starts in the morning, as it were. So those aren't really full fast days. The one full fast day that we have is Tisha B'Av. It's a 24-hour fast day. It's very similar to Yom Kippur. It's a true Tanit Tzibur. So that's one aspect to Tisha B'Av. That's one, or might say one of the hats that Tisha B'Av wears. But then there's another side to Tisha B'Av, and that is that Tisha B'Av is not just a fast day, but Tisha B'Av is a day of national mourning. And in fact, Tisha B'Av is the conclusion of what we call the 3 weeks, which begins with Shiva B'Tammuz. And during the course of these 3 weeks, there are successively more severe restrictions in terms of mourning practices. So that, for example, there's the week before Tisha B'Av, the week of Tisha B'Av, Ashkenazim have the 9 days, which is sort of an expansion of the week before Tisha B'Av. And then there's just before Tisha B'Av starts, we eat the meal, sit on the ground. And the day of Tisha B'Av itself is essentially parallel to what we call Shiva. We know that in mourning, there's 12 months for parents. There's 30 days for a relative who has died. And then, of course, there's the Shiva. There's the 7-day mourning period. And within the Shiva itself, there are different gradations. There's the first day, which is the most severe, day of bitterness. There are the first 3 days, which are called Bechi in the Gemara, days of crying. And the last days are called Hesped, days of eulogy. So within Shiva, there are different components, but basically, we speak of a mourner sitting Shiva. And Tisha B'Av then is the day of mourning. It's basically Shiva. It's interesting that I believe when I was last year in Israel and observed Tisha B'Av in Israel, and we had a whole program there. And I saw in the Edot Mizrach prayer book, might have been Moroccan, I don't remember, that I believe, unless I'm mistaken, at the end of the evening service, the greeting to the next person is, Hamakom yinachem etchem im shavei leitzion v'Yerushalayim. That's what we say to mourners. So the day of Tisha B'Av itself is a day of mourning. So it has 2 different hats. On one hand, it's a fast day, and a regular real fast day, severe fast days with similar to Yom Kippur in that respect. And on the other side of it, it's a day of mourning. Now, the question is, what is the difference between a fast day and a day of mourning? There are halachic differences. There are different observances between one who fasts and one who mourns. There are different rules. Some are the same and some are different. For example, the mourner, in principle, in theory, is forbidden to study Torah. The mourner doesn't, in theory, study Torah. And from that perspective, Tisha B'Av is a day where it would be forbidden to study Torah. But on the other hand, on a fast day, we've never heard of a impermissibility to study Torah, quite the opposite. When the Talmud describes the fast day, part of that day is the study of Torah. The clash between the two of them, I think, is most striking when it comes to a prayer. When it comes to prayer, so the one who's fasting, a fast day fundamentally is a day of prayer. And we add prayers on a fast day. Typically on a fast day, there are additional prayers. On even the minor fast days, we recite what are called Sleekholt, penitential prayers, additional prayers. Of course, Yom Kippur Sleekholt is the major piece of the service, but even on the other fast days, after Shemona Esrei, the practice is to say Sleekholt. Sleekholt is the repetition of the attributes of God's mercy, Hashem Hashem Rachum V'Chanun. That's true of all the fast days, except for one. There's one fast day where we, at least presently, recite no Sleekholt whatsoever, and that's Tisha B'Av. The one real fast day we have, we don't say Sleekholt. And not only don't we say Sleekholt, but it's actually very interesting that we don't say Tachanun either. The penitential prayer that are typically recited after the Shemona Esrei, Tachanun, are not recited on Tisha B'Av. Now, there's a very strange reason given for that, as understood, which is that Tisha B'Av in the Megillat Eicha is called the Moed, a special day. It is a special day, but Moed often is associated with a day of rejoicing, the Moadim U'Simcha. So the idea is there's this tradition that the Mashiach will come on Tisha B'Av. So someday it will become one day, who knows when, it will be a very happy time. And for that reason, it's argued by many, we don't say Tachanun. Tachanun is not recited on happy days, on Shabbat, on festivals. We don't say Tachanun. But of course, when you think about it, it is exceedingly strange. And actually in the Machzor Vitri is a siddur which was written by Rashi's pupils. and often contains many of the ancient Ashkenazic traditions, there's a different reason given for not reciting Tachanun on Tisha B'Av. Rabbi Soloveitchik was very fond of this approach. That Tachanun essentially is part of the Amidah. It's complementary to the Amidah. And the idea is that on Tisha B'Av, we don't say all our prayers. We leave things out. We don't say Sleekholt. We don't say Tachanun. We don't say Ne'ilah, which according to the Talmud should be recited on a real fast day. We say it on Yom Kippur, Ne'ilah. We don't say Ne'ilah on Tisha B'Av. And why is that? Why are we limiting prayer on Tisha B'Av? And we limit prayer on Tisha B'Av for a different reason, and that is because whereas it is true that on a fast day you say more prayers, but the mourner says fewer prayers. And in particular, Tisha B'Av, one of the verses that are cited from the Megillah that we just read, Satam Tfilati, my prayers have been stopped up, as if God doesn't want to hear our prayers. So the mourner typically limits prayer. The faster adds prayer. So here you have a genuine conflict between the two elements of Tisha B'Av. And the question is, which one takes precedence? So I think it's fair to say that for the most part, Tisha B'Av as a day of mourning has trumped Tisha B'Av as a fast day. Fundamentally, the primary way we think of Tisha B'Av, observe Tisha B'Av, primarily is a day of mourning. Having said that, I think it's fair to say that over the course of Tisha B'Av, we change it a bit. In other words, as Tisha B'Av begins, we start with Eicha, and that's certainly all about mourning, and it's certainly about sitting on the ground, and a person that's fasting doesn't sit on the ground. These are practices for the mourner. And in the morning also. In fact, it's very interesting that tomorrow morning, typically the Haftorah read in the morning of Tisha B'Av from Yirmiyahu is recited with the same tune that we say Eicha, a Sofa Sifeim, and it's recited with the Eicha Trup, with the Eicha Tamim. But when it comes to the afternoon, the Haftorah we say in the afternoon on Tisha B'Av, which is the standard Haftorah for all the fast days, Tirshu Hashem B'Ki Matzo. There it's recited typically amongst the Ashkenazim with the regular Tamim that we always use when we say the Haftorah. So one can see in that a movement from fundamentally focusing on the day of mourning, which is true in the morning, and we say keynote tomorrow morning. I'll get to the keynote shortly. But as we progress through Tisha B'Av, it becomes more a day of fasting and less a day of mourning. And now the question is, what is the difference between a day of fasting and a day? I'm not talking about the technical differences. The practices reflect something else. What is the main focus of the mourner? And what is the main focus of the one who is fasting? So I'll make a suggestion. If people want to speak up, just unmute yourself and talk up. But I would say that the focus of mourning is what is missing. What have we lost? That's the focus of the mourner. What don't we have? And that's the focus. When it comes to fasting, fasting is related to repentance, to tshuva. Fast days are days of repentance. The best example is Yom Kippur, but it's true of all of them. And there's a different focus, not so much on what is missing. Of course, what is missing is important, but the next step is what can we do to regain that which has been lost? Or how can we move in better directions given the reality? So that's two different foci. One has to do with what's missing, and that's a very important question, what's missing, because what we're asking is what actually is important to us, what don't we have? And very often it's, we don't think in those terms. We're living very much in the present. So coming to terms with what's missing is very important. It starts with the destruction of the temples, and which means what's missing is God, essentially, or the ability to interface with God, or seeing God's work in the world. All that is very much missing. What's missing is, of course, those people that could have helped us see those things, our teachers, those who inspire us, give us wisdom. That's missing. All those things are missing. And we focus in on not just the temples. The day of Tisha B'Av is a day of national mourning. So that's just for beginners what's very special about Tisha B'Av and why, even though Tisha B'Av from a technical standpoint may be it's not a major holiday. It's a rabbinic holiday, but I think it's one that is incredibly important for us. It gives us an opportunity to think and also to ask a lot of questions. This particular Tisha B'Av, I think, I just wanted to mention two things about this Tisha B'Av that I've been thinking about. One I think about every year on Tisha B'Av, and the other, given the pandemic, I think about an additional point about Tisha B'Av. Let me begin by saying that Tisha B'Av, we are thinking about the Jewish people. We're thinking about our own history. We're thinking about mourning for what we, the Jewish people, have lost. And there's plenty to mourn there. We have had a pretty bloody history. And I'm not talking only about ancient history. The Shoah was 70 years ago. And basically, so it's very particular in a way. And that's on one hand. But there are 2 points I wanted to make about Tisha B'Av, something to think about. I'm not here to give answers. I don't have any answers. But I do say the following. I do think the following. It comes into play tomorrow in the afternoon when we add into our prayers a little prayer called Nached. We ask God, the blessing about Jerusalem, we ask God to console us, to console the mourners of Jerusalem. And the prayer, as was written many, many, many years ago, talks about Jerusalem as an abandoned city, as a destroyed city, an empty city. Nobody lives there. It's Shomema Mibli Yoshev, nobody lives there. That raises the question, obviously, how can you say that? I mean, for starters, it's not true. Let's start with that. It's simply untrue. And secondly, maybe worse, not only is it not true, but it doesn't take into account the present reality. I remember being in Jerusalem, and I've been there several times for Tisha B'Av, looking out my window in Jerusalem and seeing an amazing city. I mean, there are more Jews living in Jerusalem today than ever before. Now that we don't have problems every place, of course we do, but it's amazing what has been rebuilt after the Shoah. It's a miracle beyond miracles. And to say nothing has changed in our prayers strikes me as the height of deep ingratitude. So part has to do with dealing with the reality. How do we, on one hand, respect our past and remember it? It's very important. At the same time, is it really possible just to say the same words without thinking about the present reality? That's one, that in general, I think about every Tisha B'Av. And this Tisha B'Av, I'll speak for myself, we are in the presence of a global pandemic. And the question is, yes, Tisha B'Av is about our own story, 100% about our story. And there's nothing wrong with that, in my view. When someone is in mourning, they mourn their relative. And that has to be, and we all understand and respect that. At the same time, I think this pandemic has made it clear, at least to me anyway, I'm sure to many, that we share so much with other human beings around the world. And there's a lot of suffering at present in all corners of the world. And I think there should be some way to recognize that during our ritual and to be aware of that. I mean, the nice thing about Keynote is that they are very open-ended. and they give us all a chance to reflect upon, again, what we are missing as individuals, as a community. It really brings to the fore the reality that, for any number of reasons, during the course of history, the Jewish people have looked inward to a great extent. Not that the Jewish people have not contributed to the world. Jews have contributed a great amount to the world. But I think we have, for the most part, in our liturgy and our prayers, partially out of perhaps self-preservation, maybe for other reasons as well, it's been very an inner focus. And I think that the pandemic, actually, and where we are, I think gives us, should give us some thought about seeing ourselves not just as Jews, but also seeing ourselves as members of the human race, and coming to terms with that and understanding that, embracing that, at the same time not denying our own specific history and hopefully destiny, the contributions we have made. So I think that's an issue in general. And I think we're talking about the suffering of the Jewish people, which is completely appropriate. Tisha B'Av is the one day in the year in which we have marked off as a day of national mourning. When the Yom HaShoah was first beginning to be observed, there were many people who actually objected to Yom HaShoah. The reason was that some people felt, Rabbi Salvation felt this way, that, we have a day of mourning, and to set aside a separate day for the Shoah, he thought was not appropriate. He thought it should be included in Tisha B'Av. I'm not going to get into that whole discussion and whatever about that. But, it is a day in which, and the keynote represent this, that we are reciting keynote not just about the temple, not just about the exile from the land, but about the Crusades. And it's completely appropriate to mention other events, because that's what this day is all about. And the focus is a Jewish focus without question. On the other hand, I think the present situation does, I think, legitimately raise that issue about to what degree we want to see ourselves in our own story to include others in our story. I think we should do that in general. The question is, in the Tisha B'Av, to what extent it should be done is a very interesting question I think we should be thinking about. So those are the two issues I wanted to mention in terms of Tisha B'Av. The first one being one that for many years has interested and to some degree perplexed and disturbed me, which is to what degree we deal with the present reality. Can we actually have the same Tisha B'Av today that we had 100 years ago? It strikes me that, leaving Nachem aside, I don't say that Nachem, there are other versions of it, but leaving that detail aside, I think the larger question is a very important question. Okay, if anyone wants to speak up or something, please do.
Yeah. Rabbi Silber, it looks like we had two questions.
Go ahead.
One was from Andy Mendes. Andy, you should be able to talk if you want to unmute and ask your question.
I don't have a question.
Oh, sorry, I may be.
No, I think I touched the thing by mistake.
Oh, okay. Okay, in that case, we have one question from Andrew Olkin, who asked, should we be fasting for COVID? And kind of how that plays into some of what
many of us, I'm sure, are fasting. The question is, what is the focus of the day? I would say that on Yom Kippur, which is a very different day, I'm typically very into Yom Kippur. It's my favorite day of the year. And when someone says have an easy fast, this is not, believe me, I'm no saint, but I never think about Yom Kippur as a day that you fast, actually. I'm thinking about what the day is about, which is thinking about the past, thinking about all the mistakes, plenty of them, thinking about reconciliation, thinking about the davening and its complexity and its beauty, the fast day, the fasting is actually very secondary. You know, the fasting is about that it's a different kind of day. So that's as far as Yom Kippur is concerned. It sets it off as a different day. It marks it as a different day, as a solemn day, etc., etc. It is true that fasting is seen in the tradition as, you know, another way of service, maybe represents self-sacrifice or whatever it is. You know, so I think whether in terms of the COVID situation, yeah, I think we should be cognizant of it. Obviously, each of us should try to figure out a way to be helpful. That's for sure. So again, is fasting a way to mark it as a significant? I have personally no objection to it. I mean, this is not my, you know, I don't make those kind of decisions, but I think to mark it off as to recognize that there's a lot of suffering in the world and that we are mindful of it, we care about it. Fasting is traditionally one way to do that. Fasting, prayer, you know, philanthropy, you know, tzedakah, etc. I think the most important thing would be to figure out ways to be helpful to others. But it's true that fasting has typically been a way to mark something as serious. And you know, I mentioned in my introductory remarks about Purim, it's what Esther says: get all the Jews together and fast for 3 days. I'm going to go in there and see what I can do, and I can change the evil decree. So there you have the idea of fasting as a religious activity which marks something as significant. Okay, anybody has any questions, just, you know, either hand them off to Michael or unmute and speak up. Everybody's welcome to talk. Let me say something about the keynote as we have them traditionally at night and during the daytime. And here there's very interesting, I would say a difference between the Sephardic tradition and the Ashkenazic tradition. The Ashkenazic tradition, essentially, tonight, the night of Tisha B'Av, has virtually no keynote whatsoever. The one keynote that's found, Zachar Hashem Mahayolanu, which is the first keynote that is recited by the Ashkenazim, is basically a restatement of the last chapter of Eicha. It's a kind of continuation, one might say, or restatement of the last chapter. And the keynote that we have in many of the keynote books that we have for the night of Tisha B'Av, what's interesting about them is that they are basically not written by Ashkenazim. They're essentially Sephardic. There's one by Ibn Gabiro, there's one by Ibn Ezra. The Ashkenazim in general, it would appear, did not say keynote tonight. They said virtually nothing tonight. They said Eicha. They said the book of keynote, but they said not more than that. On the other hand, in the daytime, the custom of the Ashkenazim was to say many keynote. And many of these keynotes are written by these, I would say, the poet laureate of the Ashkenazim, who was Eliezer Kalir. Eliezer Kalir was not a Ashkenazi, lived in the land of Israel, probably about the 7th century, but he was adopted by the Western Jews, the Ashkenazim, as we call them, as our poet laureate. The Sephardic Jews didn't need Eliezer Kalir. They have Ibn Gabiro, they have Yehuda Levi, etc., the Ibn Ezras, and you name it. And they have for the most part, a different set of keynote. They do say some keynote at night, and they say some keynote in the day, and there's some overlapping between the two of them, but they're very different. And I want to say something about Eliezer Kalir, whose keynote are often recited in the day of Tisha B'Av. We have a whole program tomorrow. I myself, many years ago, when Drisha first began, I used to I used to lead the keynote in the daytime, 7-8 hours straight. We go, and we'd only do 3 or 4 or 5 keynotes, but we would study the keynote. And this is an interesting difference between the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim as far as keynote are concerned. let's say tomorrow morning, when traditionally are keynote recited. So I was interested about this. I saw that in the Edot Mizrach, in the actual Sephardic traditions, the keynote were recited right after the Amidah. Right after the Amidah, the keynote were recited. What is interesting, and I'm quite convinced that was the earlier tradition. What is very curious is that if you recall, tomorrow morning, after the Amidah, we take the Torah out and we read the Torah Tisha B'Av morning from the Parshat Va'etchanan, and we read a Haftorah from Yirmiyahu. And after the Haftorah, I don't remember if we put the Torah back or not, or the Torah is still out. I don't recall. But after the Haftorah, we begin to say keynote. So there's actually two different traditions about when keynote are recited. And it strikes me that these two traditions are saying two very different things about the keynote and their significance. What the Sephardic tradition says, basically, is that normally speaking, after Shmona Esrei, we say Tachanun. There was a tradition to say Hashem, Hashem, Kerachim v'chanun, Yud Gimel Midot. Tachanun is recited right after the Amidah. On Tisha B'Av, there's no Tachanun. So instead of Tachanun, in the place we normally would have said Tachanun, we are saying keynote as an extension of the Shmona Esrei. And that makes perfect sense, I think. It makes perfect sense. It's where, for example, on the minor fast, you say Sleekholt. On Tisha B'Av, after the Amidah, you say keynote. But the Ashkenazic tradition is different, and that is we say the keynote after the Haftorah. We read the Torah, we read the Haftorah, and we say keynote. And it strikes me, and the keynote that we Ashkenazim, those who Ashkenaz say, start with about 15 to 20 keynote of Eliezer Kalir. Now, Kalir's keynote, which are incredible beyond belief, they are also virtually impossible to understand. The only way to understand Kalir is to study it. There is no other way. Because what it is many, many, many allusions to various midrashim, all kinds of clever interpretations. And you got to study it, and you got to see what the sources are and how Kalir is using it and what Kalir is trying to say. And the unbelievable complexity of the way it's organized. I mean, it's beyond belief. So the Kalir, probably the most famous of the Paitanim, what Kalir stuff is all about are things that we study. What Kalir is about is studying the situation. It comes right after you read the Torah. You read the Torah, you read the Haftorah. Reading the Torah and the Haftorah about the study of Torah. And after we finish with that, then there's the custom to read Kalir's poems and others, which I think the idea behind it is to study it. And the idea of study is, I think, a simple one. And that is that we are mourning on Tisha B'Av. But the question is, what are we mourning? When someone loses a relative, so the one who's sitting Shiva knows what she or he is mourning. That's clear. And then of course the people come and they console, and there's a conversation about the person. You always learn new things. And it's, sometimes there were difficulties, but the focus should be at least clear. Sometimes people digress to other things, but the focus should be clear. But on Tisha B'Av, the question is, what actually are we mourning? We're mourning something, but what is that something? And therefore, that requires some deep analysis, some very deep study about what is missing, what's been lost, why it should matter. So that's the idea of Eliezer Kalir. Kalir is all about studying on Tisha B'Av those things that allow us to understand better what the day is about. The alternative tradition is much less about study, but more perhaps about experience It's about evoking certain emotions. And that's one distinction between those two. And what I find also interesting, another distinction between the Ashkenazic and the Sephardic traditions is that tonight, the Ashkenazim basically say nothing. They say nothing. These Sephardim have some very interesting keynote, including a kind of manishtana. If you go to a Sephardic synagogue, they recite the manishtana. You know, the first night of Pesach, the night of the Seder, and the night of Tisha B'Av are always the same day of the week. It always falls that way. And the Medrash talks about that. And the contrast between what happened when we left Mitzrayim, B'tzeiti mi Mitzrayim, and B'tzeiti mi Yerushalayim, which is a kina, a Sephardic kina that Ashkenazim say in the daytime. The Ibn Ezra wrote it. But they say that at night as well. Manishtana, how different is this night? And it's a contrast to Pesach. So that's one of the well-known keynote of this. The Ashkenazim say nothing. And for the Ashkenazim, tonight is a night of silence, actually. And that's actually a very important point, that we can't always talk. We have to learn sometimes not to speak, to live with the silence. So that is typically the tradition of the Ashkenazim, but so that's why all the Ashkenazim actually say at night, what's Ashkenaz is the last chapter of Eicha. The keynote that we say are keynote of the five chapters of Eicha. They are the keynote. We're not going to say more than that. In the daytime, we say more. I will mention here something interesting that Rabbi Soloveitchik used to say. He actually was one of the main people who put Tisha B'Av on the Jewish map. Because I remember when I was in his Shiva going to Boston, and he would talk 7-8 hours about, he was studying the keynote. When I say the keynote, maybe 3 or 4 of them. It took him 8 hours, but it was each line by line. And suddenly Tisha B'Av became, and we at Drisha did the same thing. It's a 7-hour program, it's an 8-hour program. We have keynotes, we had classes, we had a movie typically, and it's a full day. Actually, you feel that something happened on that day. He argued, he claimed that the reason that we say, we Ashkenazim anyway, say the keynote after the Haftorah, and the reason we start at night with Eicha, which is very strange to read the book at night. We don't even read it in the daytime, typically. There is a custom to read it also in the day, but typically it's not done. And what he argued was the following. And this is part of his larger conception that he put out there, which I think is questionable in my view, but what he argued was that in general, prayer requires a kind of invitation. You can't just pray, you need an invitation. And when it comes to keynote, he argued, you really need an invitation because the keynote contain within them many, many complaints. When you look at the keynote in the daytime, some of them are very pointed complaints about the situation of the Jewish people in the past. Okay, we're not so great. Let me ask you, is the rest of the world better? That wasn't really a question. And the point is, okay, but how come we're singled out for all this tragedy? So there are plenty of complaints. And he argued that what allows us to complain, among other things, is that others who have come before us complain. The Haftorah that we read tomorrow morning from Yirmiyahu talks about, Yirmiyahu says, Kiru la'mekonanot utzvowena. Call the wailing women and let them wail. The wailing women seem to have deep insight into the human condition. So call the wailing women, that's what the Haftorah says. So if the wailing women are called, it's okay to mourn. So we follow in their footsteps. And the same thing is true of night. The book of Eicha, which is ascribed traditionally to Yirmiyahu, no one knows who wrote it, but it's ascribed to Yirmiyahu. So it contains within it all kinds of complaints. Chapter 2 in particular, Rei Hashem v'yabito, God, look who's suffering over here, the little children. So there are all kinds of complaints. So he saw the book of Kinot, Eicha, and the Haftorah as giving us a precedent and giving us a legitimacy to engage in keynote. And I think the important point is that when you look at the keynote, I certainly encourage everybody to look at the keynote. They're very varied, and they do contain all kinds of statements, some of which are very direct indictments of what goes on in the world. At the same time, there's a recognition of that we're hardly blameless. So there's that as well. So again, to repeat what at least the Ashkenazic tradition, the night is essentially about silence, and the daytime is about study. And that's one approach. There are many approaches. The other focus, I think, is more about the experience, more about putting ourselves in a certain frame of mind and trying to connect to what happened in the past from an experiential standpoint, an emotional standpoint. And it's not one or the other necessarily, they're both present. But I think with Kollel in particular, it's simply impossible to understand Kollel except if you study it. Now, I just wanted to repeat one last point. I'll make a couple of other points before I stop, and that is, and then if anybody has comments or questions, please speak up. That again, Tisha B'Av is, and the keynote, you see this. The keynote are not limited to the temple at all. The keynote contain within them, and some very beautiful keynote, which talk about the Crusades. Some very, very powerful keynote, unbelievably powerful keynote. And then we have included at the end of the keynote tomorrow, there is a whole set of keynote called Sion. The most famous of them is Yehuda Halevi, Sion Alot Tishali L'Shlom Asirayach, the great poem of Yehuda Halevi, which talks about Sion. And those Sion poems, or elegies actually, talk not so much about the destruction of Sion, they talk about its form of beauty. And I think that's also part of the Shiva. I mentioned that the Shiva, the 7 days of Shiva, the first 3 days are called crying. The first day is called bitter. The first 3 are the crying, Bechi. The last 4 are Hesped. And Hesped, eulogy, means to look back as a kind of appreciation. To appreciate, you only appreciate what's lost when you appreciate what was. So the idea of the Tzion poems at the end, tomorrow morning, at the very end, are about trying to appreciate the beauty of Tzion, what is possible, what could be possible, etc. So within the keynote itself, I mentioned the movement during the course of the day, from the morning to the fast day, from looking at what's missing to trying to repair what's missing. Fast day is all about repairing and reconciliation. Yom Kippur being the best example. Repentance. How can we make it better? How can we correct the past? Move in a different direction. So you have that over the course of Tisha B'Av, but even over the course of the keynote tomorrow, there's the movement from the temple to generalizing it, and at the end to trying to remember the beauty, remember the good things. It's very similar. Shiva is that way, I think, a good Shiva. You know, very often there are problems, but there are all kinds of issues. But typically there were good things there. To try to remember those good things and to appreciate what we had. And then the next step would be to try to regain what has been lost. And to figure out those things that have been lost, you know, how do we try to get them back again? I think that's one of the questions. Let me say just a couple of words about Eicha that we just read. And just a couple of words. I'll say 2 things about Eicha. First of all, the word Eicha is the first word. We have 5 chapters of Eicha. Chapter 1 begins with Eicha. Chapter 2 begins with Eicha. Chapter 4 begins with Eicha. Chapter 3 is very different, actually. And there are many traditions, actually, and we didn't do this evening, and I didn't grow up with this either, but there is a tradition to have a different tune for chapter 3. Because chapter 3 is very personal, Ani HaGever. It's not about the community, it's about individual people. We remember that the suffering of the communities consist of individuals. So we want to emphasize that in our Lamentations. And it's very interesting that the last chapter, unlike all the others, all the other chapters are in alphabetical order. They're all alphabetical. When you come to the last chapter, Zechar Hashem Ahayolanu, that's not in alphabetical order. But what is extremely curious is that the last chapter contains 22 verses, which all the alphabetical chapters, 1, 2, and 4, the Jewish alphabet is 22 letters. So last chapter is not alphabetical in terms of alphabet, but it does, by coincidence, it's hard to believe it's a coincidence, contain the same 22 verses. So that's the Eicha. And the three of them start with Eicha. The concluding chapter is not, and chapter 3 is not. So the word Eicha is an interesting word. Let me say one thing about Eicha, and then I'll conclude with a last thought. And if anybody, please speak up. Question, comment, whatever, more than welcome.
We had a few questions that I
Yes.
can try to, and some of the folks who asked them may also be able to speak up themselves. But we had a few about how do you think about the balance between, so for example, we have one asking, how about Zechariah's broadening the reason for fasting and mourning to the need to continue to strive for a just and compassionate society, and kind of including that in addition to the notion of mourning for the physical destruction. We have a few other questions about...
by the way, I don't think we're mourning just for the physical destruction.
Sorry?
I don't believe we're just mourning for the physical destruction.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, let me be very blunt about this. This is just one guy talking. When I sit up at night wondering about the future and what I would hope for the world, I must confess that rebuilding the temple is not on my list. So it's not about rebuilding the temple. For me, and I suspect that for many people, it's not about rebuilding the temple. But the temple is a place where God is present. And living in a world where God seems very absent, that is something which is, I think, very troubling. Of course, one solution may be that God works through us. So I would say that, yes, I would say that, and the keynote contained, for example, the story of the 10 martyrs that we read also on Yom Kippur, Saharuge Malchut. We have that in the keynote on Tisha B'Av as well. It's not physical destruction. These are our teachers. These are people who are spiritual guides who gave us all kinds of insight. And, that's part of how one lives in the world. So my point about what's missing, as opposed to what do you do about it? What you do about it is a fast day. What you do about it is, fast days are about making commitments. That's what a fast day is. It's trying to figure out what could be better, and we're all committing to, and everybody makes their own commitments. Everybody's in a different place. Everybody has different priorities, different abilities, different gifts, different passions. No one stands in the other guy's place, that's for sure. So sure, a more just world is certainly a worthy enterprise. It's a big project. So sure, nothing I said suggests that we shouldn't be. Everybody's got to make that choice for themselves. There are many ways to serve. That's something that, I believe in, and that's what Drisha actually represents. There are many people with different kinds of commitments who come together. No one's trying to convince the other guy they're wrong. It shouldn't be. You have to understand, different people are in different places. You create a place where people can be whom they think they should be. And everybody, hopefully, the study of Torah, we have a sense that we are commanded beings, that we are commanded to do good in some way or another. We're in this world to make it a better place. That's something very central. The particular form that it takes, that's another story. So I would say two things. I would say it's not just about the physical suffering. I don't think that's the center. That's not the focus at all in the keynote, actually. It's about a loss of, it's about the loss of the sacred. And the loss of the sacred is connected to many things. It's connected to the loss of not just God's presence, but I would say human dignity. created in God's image. And I think it's a world in which very often, people are not respected, and people are in situations where they're living and can't be respected because they live in just a terrible situation. So I think that's, as it says, as Yeshaya said, all I created was for my glory. So to create a world that reflects God's glory, that's in keeping with the prophetic statement. So I've not suggested what paths we should take, and I never will suggest it. But everybody's got to make that choice. But the idea that we are commanded to try to do something and to deal with the realities that we all face, sure. Well, what other comment, Michael?
Let's see, we had a few questions. We had one asking about a little more about the potential literary significance of chapter 5 having 22 verses but not being alphabetical.
Right.
We also had another question, more of a historical question, about who consolidated the keynote and when they were attached to Tisha B'Av.
I don't know the historical question. It's quite old, because Kollel is already writing. Kollel is not the first. Kollel is following Tisha B'Av as a central day. I put this, Tisha B'Av is in the Mishnah. The Mishnah, it's very interesting. The Mishnah talks about Tisha B'Av and Shivasa B'Tammuz. From the Mishnah, they seem almost to be on the same plane. When you come to the Gemara, it's clear that Tisha B'Av takes precedence. The main day is Tisha B'Av. But this is a very long time ago. And Kollel is writing extensively for Tisha B'Av, so it's got to be really quite early. That is understood as a day of mourning that's quite early. The Gemaras are clear about this. Tisha B'Av is a day of mourning, that's for sure, and not just a fast day. In terms of the last chapter of Eicha being 22 verses, but not in alphabetical order, I don't know what to say about that, but it is an interesting phenomenon, something to think about. What else? Any other questions? If not, I'll just finish with a couple of minutes. Anybody else?
We had a few more. We had one asking, what did you mean when you spoke about the stage of mourning that entails regaining what you lost? And let's see, did we have any others? Yes, and we had one asking, what do you think the difference is, where do you think the difference in approach stems from in terms of experiential versus internal reflection?
It's very hard to know where these things stem from, and I'll tell you, it's not, for the sake of kind of heuristic, educational purposes, very often we make these very clear-cut distinctions. I don't believe this distinction in reality is clear-cut. I believe that the learning itself has an experiential piece to it, and I believe that it's not black and white. It's a question more of, I would say, focus, or a question of more, emphasis. I say with Kollel, it's hard to know where things come from. The fact of the matter is that the Sephardic poets, who are amazing, Yehuda Halevi, Ibn Ezra, Ibn Gabiro is my favorite, and they're great, but Kollel is completely different. The Ibn Ezra famously criticized Kollel, but I don't think Ibn Ezra appreciated the genius of Kollel, and the genius is beyond belief. The poets, the Paitanim like Kollel, are actually interpreters of the Bible and of the Gemara, but they're profound interpreters, and they're engaging in interpretation. I would say they engage in what we would call midrash. And the idea of midrash is we have a sacred text, and the text continues to speak to us throughout the generations. And midrash is the person living whenever, confronting the ancient text and asking our questions from our experience. So I would say that's the idea of midrash. The idea behind midrash is that these sacred texts continue to speak, but we have the both opportunity, maybe obligation, to try to figure out how they speak today to us. And we look at the text and we try to figure it out, and that's a whole enterprise. I didn't mean to suggest that it's just, Kollel is impossible to understand. That was the Ibn Ezra's point. He says, when I write poetry, it's very beautiful, it's very simple, it's understandable. When this guy writes poetry, he makes up his own words, and it's impossible. So that's the critique. There's something to that critique. But on the other hand, there's something to the study. So it's, it's not one or the other. I believe fervently that study has both an experiential element to it, and it's very important. And so is the emotional, and the singing and the experiential and the emotional was incredibly important from a religious standpoint. Our temple was a place of song, so it's not one or the other. I didn't mean to suggest that it's one or the other. That was not my intention. Why it's this way or that way from a historical standpoint, I don't know, but it's quite old, clearly. Okay, so anything else I didn't respond to?
No, I think that is, I think if we want to wrap up.
All these questions require much more time, there's no doubt. But it's already 5 minutes over my time. Let me just conclude with a couple of brief thoughts. First, the word Eicha. Speaking of career, so Eicha is related to the word Eich. How could it be? It's like a shocker. These events are shocking. How could it be? How could it be a city that was once vibrant and populous and filled with joy, and suddenly it's empty? How's that possible? Things can change very quickly. Eicha, how's it possible? What's interesting about Kalir, actually, just to give you one example of the genius of Kalir. Kalir, in tomorrow morning, we have these keynote. He takes the word Eicha, and he plays with Eicha. He has 3 different meanings to the word Eicha. Eicha means Eicha. Eich, how could it be? Sense of amazement. How could it be? That's one play on Eicha. Then Kalir has another kina where he talks about, what might say, the causes. He looks back at history and he says the destruction of the temple was almost preordained. And looking back from where we are now, that happens when you study history. You look back at history, how could this happen? And you begin to look back at history and you say, something, there were already telltale signs in the past. So Kalir has a kina where he talks about things that happened, sort of we should have been cues that this kind of thing could happen. And the first thing he mentions is the story of the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve eat of the forbidden fruit, and after they eat of the fruit, they realize they're naked and they're hiding. And God is walking through the garden, and God called to Adam, Vayikra Hashem Elokim Adam, Vayomer lo Ayeka. And God said, where are you? Now, the word Ayeka in the unvocalized Hebrew is Aleph Yud Kaf Hey, which is Eicha. So Kalir, either quoting a medrash or inventing a medrash, who knows with him, Ayeka can be read as Eicha. Eicha means, Ayeka means, where are you? Ayeka is someone, a parent looking for a missing child. Where are you? The concern. Eicha has a different meaning. Eicha could mean, how could this happen? Eicha could mean a chest up. We don't hear the voice. Eicha could mean, what did you do? How could you do this? Eicha could mean, how could this happen? How could this happen to us? We have something going, it's so beautiful. How could this happen? So Kalir takes the word Eicha, and the word Eicha, which means how, he suddenly reads into Ayeka, which is written as Eicha. And then, just a couple of keynotes later on, he takes the word Eicha and he does something else with the word Eicha. Aleph Yud Kaf Hey, he says Eiko. Where is the Ko? Where is the Kaf Hey? Now the word Ko, of course, is part of the covenantal promise to Abraham. Vayomer lo Ko yeh zarecha, or the binding of Isaac. Ani v'anar nelcha ad Ko. And then Kalir has a different thought. What happened to the covenant? What happened to the agreement? What happened to the mutual obligation to each other? Which is a criticism of us, but it's even more criticism of the divine. What happened? There's a critique here. So I give an example of how Eicha, which is the first word we say tonight, and the dominant word in the keynote of tonight, what Kalir does with it. It's a sadness. It's a sense of amazement. How could this happen? It's an indictment. And then it's a recollection of a covenantal past, which for Kalir is not over. It doesn't mean that the relationship is over. It means we've hit there's a bumpy spot in the road, but it's something that could be that could be regained. So this is an example of what Kalir does and how he plays with the text. Actually, it's what we would call midrash. That for Kalir and for the Ashkenazic tradition, Tisha B'Av was a day of midrash, an attempt to interpret the text in a way that speaks to our particular concerns. And I just want to conclude with a last thought about regaining the past. What I meant about regaining the past, we have before us a text, and the text, Eicha, the book of Eicha, the keynote, make points about what is actually missing. It very much reminds me of the fixed text that we have, the text of prayer. And fixed texts are always problematic. To daven the same thing every day, many daven 3 times a day, the same words. I mean, but on the other side of it, and this is, I'm not minimizing the problems, but what the Amida does is it says, this is what you should be aspiring to. This is what you need in your life, not what you want. This is what you need to live in life. You need insight and wisdom, need good health, need the ability to be forgiven. You need to be able to make a living. And you need to be able to live in a place that's secure and safe, a place of fairness and equity. That's what you need in life. You don't need anything else. That's what the Amida says. And then the assumption behind this fixed text is, okay, this is what you need. Now you have to strive to gain those things in order to live a blessed life, a life of service, a life where you stand before God, etc., etc. And I say the Tisha B'Av is exactly about that. The first step is to figure out what is actually missing. What is missing? What should we be caring about? I mentioned one example, the fact that we've lost so many people who could have directed us or could have taught us in the distant past and the recent past. We lost a lot of our teachers, a lot of our spiritual guides. We lost so many things. And to have one day in the year where we can ask any question we want. We can challenge God if we wish to do so on Tisha B'Av. And that's the first step, because till we understand what's missing, we can't then take the next step, which is each of us to figure out, okay, missing 10 things. Let me pick one thing I care about deeply that speaks to me that I can try to deal with. And I'm going to work on this. Let me pick one thing. So I think that's what Tisha B'Av gives us. It's an opportunity to leave the normal routine, the idea of the fasting. It's a different kind of day. And to think about, what's really bothering us? What do we feel should be better, could be better? And how do we work towards it individually, maybe with other people together? So that I think is the opportunity that Tisha B'Av gives us. Even though I said it's a minor day from one perspective, I don't think it's a minor day. I think it actually is a day of great promise. So let's hope we have a meaningful Tisha B'Av, and even more important, have a meaningful post Tisha B'Av. Okay, so good evening, and I hope tomorrow we continue, and everybody's welcome to join our program and to reflect upon these issues and how we can move forward. Is there anything else now, Michael, or that's it?
No, thank you very much, Rabbi Silber. I am going to just give folks a sense of what we are going to have available tomorrow. From 10:30 to 12:30 tomorrow morning, we are going to have a discussion going deeper into various keynotes, some of the ones that Rabbi Silber has discussed, as well as a few others. That's going to be co-led by Rabbi Daniel Reifman and Rabbi Elisa Sperling. We're going to take a quick break and then have a few classes in the afternoon. At 1 p.m., we have the impossibility of mourning Zoharic Thoughts on 2 Millennia and Counting of Tisha B'Av with Dr. Nathaniel Berman. At 2:30, we have On Suffering and Metaphors, Limits and Opportunities with Dr. Tammy Jacobowitz. And at 4 o'clock, we have God Who Suffers With, Divine Presence Amidst Pain with Rabbi Dr. Julia Watts-Belzer. At 4 o'clock tomorrow, there's also a parallel session for high school women, The Poetics of Destruction, a text study and interactive workshop led by Shira Hecht-Koller. So we have a full program tomorrow. That information can all be found on our website. I will put a link to that in the chat where you can register. But you can also always go to drisha.org or to our Facebook page to get more information. So thank you again to Rabbi Silber. Thank you to all of our readers for Eicha. Som Kal to everyone, and hopefully we will see you tomorrow.